Been talking about Paul and his first three missionary journeys. And now he ends up in Rome after the last journey. And when he gets into Rome, the Jews there are concerned because they think that the Jewish Christians in Rome who still hold to the law, they think that he'll be offended by Paul because they believe Paul's been teaching the Gentiles they don't have to do that. And so they kind of make an interesting request of Paul. They request that he joins himself with 4 of their number who have taken a Nazirite vow. It's a very interesting part of Scripture. They wanted to join to these 4 other people who have taken this Nazirite vow, and they want him to pay for the end of the vow. So a Nazirite vow means you can't cut your hair, you can't have anything to do with a grape, you can't touch anything dead or unclean. So that's what a Nazirite vow. And Nazirite vows were generally for a period of 30 days, or you could do 60 days. And even Paul used a Nazirite vow in the book of Acts. In Acts 18:18, he finished a vow and he brought his hair to Jerusalem. So there's 2 ways you could end a vow. Either you could cut, if you were not in the temple, you cut your hair, you carried your hair up, and you carried it back to the temple where you would burn it on the altar and pay your fee. Or if you were in the temple, you would shave your head and you would burn your hair on the altar and you'd pay a fee. That would end your vow. That's how a Nazirite vow would work. Now, Samson was a Nazirite from birth, so that's a little bit different story. He was supposed to be Nazirite his whole life. Of course, he cut his hair, and you know what happened with that. You know, he broke that vow. You couldn't cut your hair. But in this case, most Nazirite vows are not that way. The Bible doesn't state that only men could do a Nazirite vow, but I don't think there's any biblical examples of women doing a Nazirite vow. But it was something that they would do, and Paul was kind of in the middle of that. They wanted him to pay for that, to pay for the others as they ended their vow. And by that, he wanted to prove to them, that to the Jewish Christians, that he still supported the law. That was their thought, that would happen, that it would do these things. But unfortunately, Paul was talking to a Greek in Jerusalem. He was observed doing that. Of course, they wanted to catch Paul in a crime, so they accused Paul of bringing a Gentile into the temple, which would have been against the law. Matter of fact, there's a temple stone that basically says if a Gentile goes past this stone, that they're guilty of death. So Gentiles were not allowed in the temple court. So they accused Paul, falsely of course, but they accused Paul of bringing a Gentile into the temple. That was the accusation. And because of that, they wanted to try Paul. They wanted, of course, to kill Paul. That was eventually what they really wanted to do. And they wanted to, in that way, to get rid of him. And it becomes an interesting story. It's a very historical story. I know history bores a lot of people. I love Bible history, so it's kind of one of my things. But it's kind of a very interesting account. And so basically, I'm not going to read all that account to you or all Paul's time there. I'm going to give you the brief version, and you can read it for yourself. But basically, the first thing that they did to Paul was the Jews, it was a riot. There was a riot. And the Romans, of course, were in control of Jerusalem. And this was under Nero, under the Emperor Nero, okay? Now, Vespasian was the emperor before Nero. That might not make any sense right now, but Vespasian's son was Titus, okay? And Titus would be the emperor after Nero. Titus is who would destroy Jerusalem in 71. Basically, he was the one that would siege Jerusalem when there was an emperor yet. In 79, it was in 71 AD, Nero would die. Titus would take his place as emperor in about 79 AD. So Titus, and that'll kind of play in a little bit about what's going on, because it's very Roman. This whole thing's very Roman. So the Romans, at this time, there was no king in Judea. Now, if you look at Jesus' account, you see Jesus went before Agrippa. That was Agrippa II, and he had Galilee, okay? But there was no Roman, no king, no Herod over Judea at this time. They were governed by proconsuls. such as Felix and Festus and Pilate and those type of guys. That's who ruled for Rome. They were like Roman governors that were in place to basically keep Roman law. So when this riot broke out, they, of course, this being a Roman town, the Romans went in to stop the riot. They got Paul. They stopped the riot. They brought Paul back to this garrison. And the Roman soldier was impressed because Paul spoke Greek. And Paul said, well, let me speak to the people. So Paul got up on this, where he's above these people, where he could talk to them. And, of course, this crowd was mostly Jewish, because that's who was accusing him, was the Jews. So Paul begins to speak in Hebrew. When he did, they got very, very quiet. Hebrew was the language of the temple, and everybody spoke Hebrew. Paul was raised at the feet of Gamaliel, and he brings that up in his defense. I was raised as a Jew, raised at the feet of Gamaliel. I persecuted this sect of Christians. I was consenting or there when Stephen was stoned and consenting to the blood of Stephen. And they listened throughout that part. But then when he gets to the part that he says, but they sent me, God called and said, go to the Gentiles. And at that point, the riot broke out, and they started screaming, and they said, this man deserves death. This man deserves death. And so the Roman soldier, did what he would do. He took Paul, he chained him to a wall. He said, let's flog him and get the truth, right? And Paul said, is it right for you to flog me, a Roman citizen and uncondemned? And at that point, they went and got him, and they brought the centurion, they brought him down, and the centurion says, is it true you're a Roman citizen? And Paul says, yeah, I'm a Roman citizen. He says, I was born a Roman citizen. And the centurion says, well, I'm a Roman citizen, but it was at great cost. Cost a lot of money to buy that citizenship. Roman citizenship was important. And even though you lived in Rome, or in a Roman jurisdiction, if you didn't have Roman citizenship, you weren't protected by Roman law. But since Paul was born a Roman, and that's kind of a thought, why was he born a Roman? Some people think his parents bought the Roman citizenship. He lived in Tarsus. Maybe because he was born to them, he was a Roman citizen. A lot of people believe maybe that was the case. But he was born a Roman. And so he was scared to beat him. He said, well, we can't beat him. Matter of fact, he was even scared he'd put him in chains. He says, I can't, this could be big trouble for me because I've chained this guy, this Roman, without him being tried. And so he was, well, we don't need to do that. Well, the Jews conspired a plot to kill him. This might take me longer than I thought. I might have to do this in 2 nights. So the Jews conspired a plot. And there's 40 Jewish guys, and they basically said, listen, they said, we're not going to eat or drink anything until we kill Paul. So here's what we want you to do. We want you to call him up. So at the Sanhedrin, which is the Jewish court, 70 seats on the Sanhedrin, mostly Sadducees. So the Sanhedrin is a Jewish court, and these guys go to the Sanhedrin, and they say, listen, guys, this is the story. We've taken a vow. We're not going to eat or drink anything until we kill Paul. So here's what we want you to do. We want you to call Paul up so you can question him a little bit, and when he comes up, we'll kill him. But Paul's nephew, interestingly enough, heard of the story. And Paul's nephew goes to Paul, and he says, listen, they're going to kill you. And Paul says, you need to go tell this centurion. So the nephew of Paul, Paul's sister's son, that would make him his nephew, right? I'm never good with relationships. He goes to the centurion, and he says, oh, this is the plan. They're going to kill Paul on the road. And the centurion, he's upset by that. And so he takes these horsemen, these 200-foot soldiers, these horsemen, and he's going to send Paul to Caesarea. And basically he's going to put him before this governor. And at that time, the governor in Caesarea is Felix. So he goes before the crowd. They go back before this. He gets this argument before the Jews, and basically, as they're doing that, he says, I believe in the resurrection. Well, the Sadducees didn't believe in the resurrection, so the Pharisees and Sadducees started fighting with one another. So Paul gets out of this Jewish problem and gets into a Roman problem. But Jesus tells him, or God tells him in Acts 23, he says, take courage. You testified about me in Jerusalem. Let's testify in Rome. So he knows that he's going to go to Rome, which was his plan all along. And at that time, Felix is the procurator or governor of Judea. So he goes to there, and he goes before Felix. And Felix basically says, listen, he said, I'm going to call these Jews down, and we're going to let them try to make a case. So the Jews came down with this lawyer, and they trying to make a case. Well, Felix, he'd rather just let Jesus off. But you got to remember, this is Judea. And if he just let him off, that could kind of be a problem too, because he kind of has to make the Jews happy also, you see. But Felix is kind of corrupt, as a lot of Romans were. And so the Jews didn't really like what Felix had done in a certain situation in a town. So the Jews went to Rome and appealed to Caesar and basically said, this Felix guy, we don't like him anymore. He's kind of done this bad thing. We want you to get rid of him. So Paul stays there for about 2 years, and then Felix is replaced by Festus. But Felix, wanting to appease the Jews, decides to leave Paul in prison, doesn't let him go. So when Festus comes into office, generally when they change procurators or governors, the governors they brought in really like to clear up the matters that was left. He really would like to clear this up. And so Festus comes along, and Festus he would like to clear this up, but it's just not something that's going to happen really quickly here. It's kind of interesting. As we get into Festus, kind of an interesting side note here. Let me get where I need to be. Festus came from Jerusalem to Caesarea, and the chief priests in 25, they brought the charge to Paul, urging him, wanted a concession that he had been brought to Jerusalem. So they wanted him to bring him to Jerusalem, so once again they could kill him on the way. But Festus said, no, I don't want to do that. You need to try him where I'm at. Try him down where I'm at. Now, this is kind of interesting to me historically, because Festus is Drusilla. And Drusilla had come to Festus, and it was kind of not the right relationship. She would actually be killed in the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. But she kind of was a Jew, and she had quite a bit to do with this trying to keep Paul in prison. So she kind of had a play in that. Her and her son would both be killed in the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. You know that as Pompeii. They would both be killed in that eruption, which I think is kind of an interesting historical fact. Now Agrippa is going to come into the scene. And Agrippa, this is Agrippa the second. So Bernice, who he's with Bernice, okay? And Agrippa the second, of course, is Agrippa the first son, okay? And Bernice is his sister by another mother, half-sister, okay? And so at 13 years old, it's 14 years old, Bernice was married off. But she really didn't like the guy. Apparently she was a very beautiful woman. And Agrippa, basically, they believed it was an incest situation, okay, that Bernice and Agrippa was involved in here. But eventually, Bernice will go to Rome, and when Agrippa goes back to Rome, and not at this particular time, but later on, she will go to Rome, Bernice will actually wind up having an affair with Titus. When Titus is sieging Rome, and then when Titus becomes emperor, he has to break it off with Bernice because Bernice is a Jew. I just think these are interesting historical facts. You know, I think it brings the Bible to life to me when I know that I can read about these people and like Bernice and Festus and Felix and Agrippa and Drusilla and all these people, and they're real people. Right? And we have record of them because of Josephus and because of what he wrote and other Roman records. So we know about these people. Interestingly, Festus will only be in office for 2 years because he's going to die of an illness and before he completes like his tenure as governor. But Festus basically comes to a dilemma. The Jews want to take him back to Jerusalem. Festus is kind of in a bind. What am I going to do? I need to appease the Jews. Paul sees he's going to get railroaded, right? He thinks, well, this isn't going to go good. So Paul appeals to Caesar. We really don't understand that process. But apparently it was irrevocable. So when Paul appealed to Caesar, Festus conferred with his council, and he basically told Paul, he says, you appeal to Caesar you're going to go. So at that point, Paul was kind of locked into that. So when Agrippa comes, Agrippa wants to hear Paul. Maybe the best part of the whole story. Agrippa wants to hear Paul. And so Agrippa and Bernice come in with their pomp and their circumstance, and Paul gets to finish his defense. It's really interesting to me because Luke basically records everything that Paul's going to say in this defense, but Luke finds it so important that he gives the whole thing to us again. Now, the first time Paul tried to do this before the Jews, he got interrupted when he got to the point that he says, I'll send you to the Gentiles, and the Jews all went nuts, and he couldn't finish. But this time, before Agrippa, he gets to finish, and he addresses it to Agrippa. And he says a lot of interesting things, like this wasn't done in a corner. You know about the way. He brings a lot of ideas into this and in this whole thing, and probably one thing that I always key on, a couple of things actually in that defense before Agrippa, and that's in Acts 26. But one thing that I always key on is it's one of the where we get that statement where, of course, I don't know if it's a proper translation, but he says, almost you persuadest me to be a Christian. It comes out of that argument with Agrippa. And Paul says, I would that not you, but all men would be as I am, except for these chains. Another thing that's a kind of a highlight of Scripture to me is Acts 22:16, where Paul says, where Ananias comes to him, and he says, why tarriest thou? Arise and be baptized and wash away your sins, calling on the name of the Lord. I think it's a very important statement. Very important statement about baptism that we don't get in Acts chapter 9. So I think that's kind of an interesting statement. You can read this for yourself, but I hope when you do, maybe some of the things I said tonight make it kind of come alive a little bit for you. The people that he went before, the time frame involved. He was there for over 2 years under house arrest. People could come and see him. He was able to live, even the governor's quarters apparently. People could come and see him. He had some freedom of movement. It wasn't like he was locked away in a dungeon. And this will continue even as he gets into Rome until his second Roman imprisonment. We'll talk about that. But I'm not trying to read this to you. I'm just trying to make it come alive a little bit for you. You know, when you read it, that you think, wow, that's really neat, and those people are really real, and the relationship between Drusilla and Felix, because Felix stole Drusilla away too, just as Agrippa kind of stole Bernice away. Felix stole Drusilla away. Drusilla was apparently a very, very beautiful woman, very desirable woman, according to history, and he kind of stole her away. So there's a lot of relationships here, a lot of things going on. So I hope that it helps to bring it to life for you a little bit. If we can help you in any way this evening, won't you let it be known while we stand and while we sing.